Recently, I've been spending a lot of time with the kids. Just an average day for me involves running after them, feeding them, changing their pants, making sure that they're okay, wiping their butts. I think the most challenging part about being a parent is just making sure the kids stay safe and don't get in too much trouble. Yesterday, I took this picture of Pascal. He was climbing up on the counter and to raid this bowl of popcorn, and the next time I turned around, the whole bowl of popcorn was gone. That's a lot of popcorn for a little guy, so that was not so good. Fortunately for me, I'm not the only one who has this problem, and I draw a lot of encouragement from people on the internet who have the same problem as me, who have rambunctious kids. One mom put it really well that silence is golden, but when you have kids, silence is suspicious. And so there was one kid who was left alone with a Dalmatian and some Sharpies, and kid put the two together. Another kid asked for ice cream. They just didn't figure out what they wanted the ice cream for, but he figured, it's good on the head, nice and cool over there. Another kid wanted to write a nice message for their mom on the car by scratching it onto the car. And I can totally see my kids doing this, which makes it kind of funny for me. But at the same time, it is kind of that is the most difficult relationship I have in my life right now. It's just my relationship with my kids. It gives me a little bit of a hard time sometimes. And I wonder if all of us can relate to that in some level. Because I think all of us have difficult relationships. Let us know if you don't, and we'll all be really jealous. But I think it's really normal to struggle with some kind of relationship. Maybe it's someone who lives with you at home. Maybe it's with a significant other. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a coworker. So there's lots of people in our lives. And sooner or later, we run across people who are fairly difficult. Which leads me to my big question today. My big question is, how can we have the best possible relationships? I think as Christians, we have a secret weapon for the best possible relationships. And that is our relationship with God. Our relationship with God gives us a resource that nobody else has. It gives us a huge advantage in our relationships, and we do well to press that advantage. Because if we do that, then we'll have a better quality of life for ourselves, but perhaps more importantly, we'll be able to serve others because we'll be empowered by it, and we'll be able to show people a better way. People will want what we have because it's so good. And when they ask us, we'll honestly be able to say, it's because of Jesus. So here's my answer. The best possible relationships are built around our relationship with God. We can build every relationship around God, whether the person wants to cooperate or not. If the person doesn't want to cooperate, we can have God-centered independence. And if the person wants to cooperate, we can have God-centered partnership. And that's what we learned from our Bible passage today. Our Bible passage is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. It was written to a group of people who were quite different from us. They were married people. They were husbands and wives living long ago in the Roman Empire, which is a very different world than what we experience nowadays. And so it might not look at first that this passage is written to us. But this passage that I'm going to read to you contains the secret for great relationships, not only in marriage, but in all of life. These principles are very broad and very powerful. And so I'll just take a moment to read to you now from starting at verse 1. It says, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornments such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. Her daughters, if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, consider it as with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partners, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. So based on this passage, the first key to really great relationships is God-centered independence. By that I mean that even if the other person doesn't want to cooperate, you can be right with God. No matter how the other person acts, you can do what is right between you and God. And your relationship with God will give you so much strength, so much wisdom and perspective and hope. You make something really good out of a bad situation. This past week, I was looking at an internet article. It's about engineering hacks or ghetto engineering solutions. These are solutions that people did for their homemade problems that they were too lazy to buy the real thing. One guy wanted a cake mixer, so he took apart an electric fan and he stuck a mixer head on it. Looks like it works. Another one is from a guy who lived in his car and he wanted a way to do laundry. And so he invented the bucket. And so the bucket's attached to this tire. I imagine you can do a lot of sloshing there. I'm not sure if it's legal, but looks pretty good to me. This one's my favorite one, though. So the story behind this one is there's a guy who had a Toyota Prius, and then he crashed his Toyota Prius, and so it was like total wreck. And then he bought another Prius, and that one got crashed too. So he had two Priuses that were wrecked, but one was wrecked in the front, and one was wrecked in the back. So he cut them up, and he welded the two good halves together, and he ended up with this 6-door Prius. So he's driving around town in this like Prius stretch limo. It's awesome. Like it's so good, but it's so bad at the same time. I love it. But I mention these examples because relationships can be a little bit like that. You know, sometimes we don't have relationships in the best of circumstances, and we have to make something out of it. Sometimes we're really dealing with what feels like a garbage situation, or even a garbage person. Don't tell them that. They might be offended, but really, relationships can be really hard sometimes. Fortunately for us, we have instructions from the Bible to tell us what to do, and that brings us to our Bible passage. Let's read again from verses 1 and 2. Peter writes, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them don't believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." So when you look close at this passage, you see something that's very not ideal in this situation with the wives. So just to backtrack a little bit, it says, wives, in the same way. He says in the same way because he's continuing a line of thought. And the line of thought is that you find it actually in the previous chapter, in chapter 2, verse 12. We covered that last week. It's about living such a good life among other people so that they'll be interested in faith, so that they'll want what you have. And so that's what it means when in the same way. But then it says submit to your husbands. And that's the way that it worked back then. Men were on top and women had to submit. There's a huge power imbalance back in that time. It wasn't ideal, but there was nothing they could do about it. It was futile to try to fight that system at that time. So women just had to live within that system and be oppressed. But they weren't without options. Sorry. Then he talks about something else. He talks about it's stacking the deck even further against these wives. There's a case where these Christian wives were married to husbands who did not believe the same thing as them. They were pagan husbands, and sometimes these men would be very harsh because they had no God and no principle to govern their actions towards their wives. Now, I'm not saying that all pagans were like that. There are plenty of examples of very fine people who are not Christians, but wives were subject sometimes to really harsh living conditions. And even in these really harsh living conditions, there was a plan. There was a strategy. And Peter tells them what to do. He tells them, don't concentrate so much on external appearance. Don't put your hope on being beautiful. It's fine to be pretty. Don't put too much hope on that. Instead, your beauty should come from a gentle and quiet spirit, he said. That is the strategy. That's how we win souls. You want to impress your husband with a gentle and quiet spirit, which might sound kind of lame. I mean, it seems almost like he's telling these women to be kind of just doormats or pushovers or really weak. And it takes a wider look at the Bible to realize that it's not that way. That's not what he's talking about. The Bible tells us that the ideal woman, that's Xena, warrior princess that I grew up with, but the ideal woman is a warrior, at least in the heart. You find this in Proverbs 31, which talks about the ideal woman. It talks about, it introduces us to this woman as a valorous woman, a valiant woman who brings home the plunder for her Lord. That's in the Hebrew. It's a little bit hard to translate into the English, and it's Hebrew poetry, so most of the more modern, easy-to-read translations miss that detail. But if you read a really, really technical Bible, you'll get some of that language. It's military language as used for women. These are women who are strong and courageous, who are willing to fight through life and come out on top because of their relationship with God. That is the ideal for women. So let's bring that idea back to our passage, this idea of strength, inner strength for women. He says to these women to be gentle. We should remember that when you tell someone to be gentle, it's because they have an excess of strength. You only tell someone to be gentle when they have to reel in their strength so they don't hurt somebody. And similarly, when he tells them to be quiet, there's a kind of quiet that indicates a lot of strength as well. I heard a story one time about the Persian army, ancient Persia, and they would go to war sometimes, and they would line up in battle formation in absolute silence. And the enemies were really impressed by that, actually, because they knew how hard it was to maintain discipline right before a battle, because everybody's minds would be full of thoughts at that moment. They'd all be wondering, would they survive that day? Would they ever see their families again? How do they get out of this situation? So they kept silence. This silence was an indication that they weren't losing their mind, that they had their emotions under control. They weren't panicking. Most importantly, they were ready to listen to their commander and execute their battle plan at a moment's notice. And so it is with these women, and so it is with us. Our quietness is so that we can execute. It's the quietness of professionals who know what they're doing. So in verse 6, we find Peter talking about them doing good without being frightened by anything. Because that's the plan. That's how we're going to win souls. That's how they make the most out of a really bad situation. And so he's telling these women to have this God-centered independence, that no matter how bad it is at home, no matter what the other person does, you can have hope. You can have strength. We can take that principle into our own lives as well. For us, when we deal with people and things don't go our way, we can act godly. We can be right with God. When the other person hurts us, we can forgive them before they apologize, because oftentimes they will not. But we can forgive them because we're taking their sins to the cross, recognizing that Jesus died for their sin, and so there's no more punishment left for their sin. We don't have to take vengeance for it. When they're unkind to us, we can be kind back, because our kindness to them is not based on what they do for us, but rather it's based on Jesus' love for them. And as we serve them, we are serving God, and God himself will reward us. When things don't go our way and things are really tough, we can still maintain hope and joy, because we understand that God is working in all things for our good. And that's strength. And people can see that of us. That's impressive. It's impressive when we can find perspective and wisdom and hope in every single circumstance. That's how we make the best out of a bad situation. That's how we give ourselves the best chance to thrive, as well as we lead the other person to life as well. That's how we give them the best chance as well. But that said, we're talking about really imperfect and broken relationships, and oftentimes we can aim for something a little bit better than that. And so that leads me to my second point, which is that we should aim for godly partnerships. Talking about where you and the other person are on the same page together. That is the ideal. If you ever come to my house, I want to show you my exercise bike. Next slide, please. I want to show you my bike, my stationary bike. The story is that Pauline's dad was walking in an alley one day, and he found this abandoned bike, so he took it home. That's the story anyway. Let me know if you're looking for your bike. But he took this home, and he put a wooden frame around it, and in order to give it some resistance, so because it was suspended and there was no resistance, he designed this special brake mechanism, and so that we'd be pedaling against something. And then he designed a way to tighten that brake and loosen that brake while we're still on the chair. And so it really works. It is a real functional exercise bike. And it's so ugly. But it works, The thing is, though, that we all know that exercise bikes get better than this. There are bikes that they're more beautiful, that are more comfortable, bikes with TVs attached to them, bikes that monitor your progress. So it gets better than this. And I bring this up because I think this is kind of like relationships as well. Yes, we can make the most out of bad situations, and that is a discipline, and we'll have to use that in life. But we should aim for something a little bit better if we can. And so our Bible passage in the last verse talks about a little bit more of an ideal situation, a situation of partnership where the other person's actually on the same page as you. I'm going to read to you verse 7. It says, "Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers." So you might notice, if you're sharp with the details, that Peter talks to the wives and the husbands quite differently. To the wives, he just says, just try to make the most of your situation. It's bad, but that's the best you can do. With the husbands, though, he assumes that the wife is Christian. And there's a reason for this. The reason is that in that culture, men were so powerful that normally they got to choose the religion of their wife. And it wasn't ideal, but in this case, it worked out in their favor. Worked out for the better for their family. And because they could start with at least the same kind of relationship with God, they could build this kind of partnership. It wasn't an equal partnership, though. So he tells people these husbands to treat the other person with respect as the weaker partner. They were weaker physically normally, and that was important in a labor-based economy. And they were weaker in terms of social status as well. And so this is not an equal partnership, but they are on the same page. And Peter leaves no room for disrespect in this marriage. He says, treat them with respect as heirs of the gracious gift of life. And that's a really pat phrase. Heirs of the gracious gift of life. If you're an heir, that means you're destined to receive an inheritance. And every Christian has an inheritance. We are heirs of the kingdom of God. God is giving us his kingdom, and one day we will rule with him, says the Bible. So he tells these husbands to remember that these wives and these fellow Christians, they are heirs. Remember, she's royalty. She's a daughter of God. She's immortal. She's one step below divine. Treat her with that kind of respect. And can you imagine if we took this attitude into our homes? If all of us treated fellow Christians this way, especially the ones that we live with, how much difference that would make when we disagree with things, when we're annoyed with each other. It'd be transformative. And not only does the idea of heirs carry this idea of respect, but also carries an idea of mission. Because an heir is an owner of the family business. And even when they're young, even before they receive their inheritance, they are working for the family business and making it better. And so it is with us. As Christians, we're not just waiting to get to heaven, but even nowadays, we are making heaven better. We get to do that. And we get to do that with other Christians. Other Christians who can join with us on the mission. And when we do that, we find other people who'll be joining us in this most incredible work. You know, they're being transformed by God to act towards you and you towards them in a Christ-like way with awesome respect and character. You know, you're joining together in this eternally significant and infinitely significant worth. And you develop this really good and great love for each other. This love that goes so deep, so you love the other person like you love yourself. So you'd even die for each other if it came down to it. And there's no relationship like that outside of the Christian faith. This is the most perfect kind of relationship that there is. So my question is, how do we get that? How do we get that kind of relationship? My answer is that we should aim for that kind of relationship. Most of the time, those relationships won't just fall into our lap. We actually have to cultivate those relationships intentionally. Remember, years ago, I was moving in between cities. I kept on working in Calgary, but studying in Vancouver, so I went back and forth a few times. And the last time I left Calgary, I knew I was going away to go back to school, to study to be a pastor, and I'd be away for 3 years. But I had made some really good friends in Calgary. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to do something about this friendship. I'm going to make a plan. So I got out a piece of paper and started writing down, this person gets an email every 2 months. This person gets a phone call every week. This person gets some form of contact every month. And it worked. There were 3 new Christians in my Sunday school class. I ended up mentoring them, called them every week for 3 years, because we had a plan, and it worked. We had some really life-changing conversations. And one of the Sunday school teachers I worked with, I talked to her once a month, and eventually I asked her out, and we got married. And so that changed my life. Making a plan for your relationships. So I recommend it to you. Be intentional. And as you are intentional, I think you'll find that as you seek these deep relationships, these awesome relationships, some Christians will not be interested. Some Christians will just be very content to just hang out and be very casual, and you can enjoy those relationships for what they are. But some Christians will want to go deep and really join you and really partner with you on the big things of life. And those people will naturally become your best friends. And there's actually practically no limit to how good those relationships can be. And so I encourage you, in all your Christian relationships, aim for depth. Aim for real partnership in the things of eternity. And a lot of times, you might get disappointed. A lot of times, it won't work. But sometimes, it will work. And you'll end up with the greatest earthly treasure a person can have. So that is godly partnership. That wraps up my second point. So, just to conclude the sermon, our big question again is how can we have the best possible relationships? And our answer is that we can build every relationship around God, whether the other person wants it or not. If the other person doesn't want to cooperate, then we end up with God-centered independence, which means that we are right with God. We will treat the other person well. We will live out our relationship with God within our relationship, and will change the entire dynamic of the relationship for the better. But the more ideal case is God-centered partnership. And if we want those, then we take aim at those things. We seek out those relationships. And sometimes we'll be disappointed, and sometimes we'll end up with that kind of special friend that is just the greatest treasure on earth. Let's pray to close. God, I like your plan. It's a good plan. This plan to have such good relationships that people will be jealous and they'll want what we have and we'll tell them that they need you. I want that. Make it come alive in my life, in our lives. Make it happen for your glory and for our joy. Amen.